Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Biswajit Ghosh, Professor of Sociology of the University of Bardhaman. I am also the coordinator of the paper on social movement, from which I will be talking on a particular social movement. The title of this module is Ethnic Movements, the Case of India. It's written by me. In this module, we will be talking about the factors that normally leads to ethnic movement. We would begin with the conceptual issues, what do we mean by ethnicity, what is ethnic group, then go on to discuss the theoretical approaches which try to explain the different contours of ethnic movement, and then come back to the Indian scenario, look into do a kind of broad review of the ethnic movements in India in order to find out the factors which have caused such movements, so that we can link up our understanding of ethnic movements, the theoretical understanding, with the practices happening in India. Let me go ahead by noting the importance of studying this module. Let me now talk about the importance of studying ethnic movement and why at all we are interested in studying ethnic movement. If you look into the social life today, you will be surprised to know that it is full of contradictions and confrontation. There is also contestation, and many of those contestations are based on ethnic identity. Now, it was earlier argued that with modernization, gradually these loyalties based on caste, religion, language, region, and so on and so forth, they would go away with. But even in a global society, in a global village, to use Marshall McLuhan's term, we are confronting with contestations based on ethnic identities. Now, it is true that there is certain homogenization of social life today. Many of the cultural practices that we do are homogeneous. For instance, we do use computer, mobile phone, internet, so on and so forth. But at the same time, there is a rise of localism, there is a rise of ethnicity. That actually makes it interesting why actually we are talking about ethnicity. Now, if you look into the movements across countries, you would be surprised to know that ethnicity is not something local to South Asia or India. It's a global phenomenon. Global phenomenon in the sense that at one point of time it was argued that there are cracks and strains in developing countries, and ethnicity is rising only because of those cracks and strains. But now, after the breakdown of Soviet Union, there are so much of ethnic revivals, countries being formed on the basis of ethnic identity. Even in US and UK, the so-called most developed countries of the West, there is growth of ethnic identity, and in fact, after the current president of US won the election, there has been assertion of ethnic identity, saying that we want to live in this country, this also belongs to us. So the point is, ethnicity is not something limited to India or South Asia. It is a global phenomenon. We should be very serious in interpreting why ethnicity is rising and ascertain its causes. Let me now go back to the definition of ethnicity, because unless and until we are clear about defining it, I think we would fail to explain why ethnicity rises. Now, the term ethnicity is taken from an ancient Greek word named ethnos. It meant a situation where collectivities of human beings lived together and acted together. That means a human grouping who acted together, lived together, they are called ethnos. That was the meaning from which it was taken. But in sociology, we often use the term ethnicity to refer to groups which are culturally and socially shaped. Now, two terms which are most often used in these discourses on ethnicity is ethnicity and ethnic group. One should be very careful in distinguishing between ethnicity and ethnic group, because ethnicity is based on certain identities. Ethnicity is based on certain consciousness, which Paul Bruss argues compares with class consciousness. He was basically talking about consciousness as central to class. Similarly, he was talking to consciousness as central to ethnicity. That means ethnic groups might have certain identities based on, say, language, region, culture, but the existence of those identities alone do not signify that there will be ethnicity. So, you should be very clear that ethnic groups The existence of ethnic groups alone do not signify the rise of ethnicity. Ethnicity is the expressive aspect of ethnic group identity. Let me now go back to the theoretical explanation, which argues about the role of different structural and procedural factors in explaining the rise of ethnicity. I will be basically talking about 4 theoretical perspectives, but there are many more. For instance, from the Marxian point of view, ethnic differences seem to be directly a result of class contradictions and or economic contradictions. More particularly, differential allocation of resources is identified as a factor for which people belonging to marginalized section often protest. This is true to a certain extent, and we will be talking about this factor later on. But differential access or economic deprivation alone do not explain the rise of ethnicity, because there are other factors which probably other theories bring in. From the interactionist perspective, ethnicity is basically a result of cultural proximity of different groups. That means if two people belonging to two groups live together, they would become aware of their ethnic identity and would really form group. Now, while there is certain value in this instrumentalist perspective, because we often know about others only through mixing. I as something become aware of some other thing only in the process of interaction, that is true. But the point is, cultural proximity alone did not constitute or contribute to ethnicity, because many a time Bengalis living in a particular proximate cultural group do not form a group based on Bengali identity alone. There are some other factors, much larger factors, and in fact it is a complex one, which explain the rise of ethnicity. Interestingly, Rajani Kothari here argues that one of the reason for rise of ethnicity is the homogenizing tendency of the state. That means whenever you try to homogenize, there will be protest by those who do not want that kind of homogenization. A host of social scientists have argued that there are political reasons, political explanations and processes which are very much important in the rise of ethnicity. Now, with this background, let me now concentrate with the 4 theoretical frameworks that I have told I would explain. These are major theoretical explanations related to rise of ethnicity. Let me now begin with the primordialist logic. From this perspective, ethnicity is essential to human nature. Now, the primordial identities to which we are attached, for instance caste, religion, kinship, all these things, they give rise to ethnicity. That means there are certain fixed entities, ascribed entities, which actually give rise to ethnicity. Now, Edward Sheel was the first person to refer to that kind of explanation. These taken for granted explanations has certain features, and most important is that it attaches biological proximity, biological sort of proximity to ethnic identities. Point is, the point that Edward Sheel and Clifford Geertz were identifying, that the primordial attachment of kinship and loyalty, all these things are very important. These are not to be seen as so important in primary life or in social life, because often as a Bengali or a Tamilian or a Keralite, one person may attach his or her identity in a different way. There could be different other identities to which I am attached. So, obviously there are limitations to this theoretical approach. One major limitation is that it is deterministic and static. It takes it for granted that I am always governed by my ascribed identities. Even my achieved identities are important. One could also think about the identities that I could achieve in a particular context, or maybe in a particular context the way I behave. So, it has been argued that many of the primordial identities that Edward Sheel and others were talking about, they are variable. For instance, in a context I could attach much more importance to caste, whereas in other context I might give importance to the fact that I speak in Bengali. So, these two things are different, that I am attaching to a locality, I am attaching to a cultural aspect, I am attaching importance to a linguistic aspect. They might give rise to 3 kinds of different social movements. More importantly, why should we argue and why should we take it for granted that my primordial attachment is non-rational. I might even use these as a rational purpose because I might think that Bengali language is more important, right? Why should I think that I am a non-rational being attached to my caste or religion or language? So there are limitations of this theory. Let me now come back to the instrumentalist perspective. It argues that ethnicity is basically an instrument to access social, political and material resources. That means I use it as a means to reach to an end. Now this means and sort of dialogue is very important in the sense that Max Weber himself was talking about ethnic identity which facilitates ethnic group formation. In certain context, it is true that in active political situation we use our identities, cultural, religious, regional, so on and so forth, in order to promote a means. For instance, I want to win an election, so I would say I am a Bengali, so vote for a Bengali, or I am a Muslim, so vote for Muslim. So there are contexts in which I do use my identities for instrumental purpose. It has nothing to do with my belief in being a Bengali or being a Muslim or a Tamilian. Barth, who wrote a brilliant book entitled Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, he said that these instrumentalist things are formed basically in the process of interaction. It is a relational concept. Now it is true that it is instrumental, it is a relational concept, and many a time we do use it for our own benefit. Now Paul Brush had a different argument. He said ethnicity is basically an instrument for elite competition. Those who are the elites competing among themselves, they use it for their own purpose. Now that means it is an instrument basically of the elites to rule over the non-elites. Now obviously that kind of argument has serious limitations. What are the limitations? It does talk about flexibility, it does talk about situation, but to accept the fact that elites always dictates the contours of movement or thinking of non-elites is a difficult proposition. Why should the non-elites cannot think on their own? In fact, if you look into the ethnic movements, many of the movements of ethnic loyalties, they are the product of the movement itself. They were not elites earlier. So that does not mean that elites who are already established elites, they exploit ethnicity and then they use it. Those who are non-elites, they might also use ethnicity and become an elite. So the process could also be reversed. Secondly, why should I think that I always calculate on the basis of my ethnic identity? Maybe I might become emotional, like the primordialists, they argue. I might be emotional about the fact that I am a Bengali, right? So the calculation in the mind that I always calculate, I am always rational, probably it is too much to think about human capacity. So there are spontaneity in ethnicity too, even though there are other factors too. Let me now go back to the modernization perspective. This is the old one, not a new one, which argues that ethnicity is basically seen in pre-modern archaic society. This is a Durkheimian terminology that I am using, archaic society. In all our founding fathers, sociological founding fathers, Marx, Durkheim, Tönnies, Weber, they talked about cultural and social changes in modern society. So it was almost argued that with modernity, with the advent of modernity, there will be so much of changes in social, cultural and political life, and identities attached to our tradition with our primordial loyalties would gradually vanish. For instance, industrialization, capitalism, nationalism, they would gradually do away with the ethnic primordial attachments. Now, often when modernization theory see that there is rise of ethnicity despite a society modernizing, there are three counter arguments being put forward. One is that this is basically a proximate result of modernity, not the final result. That means finally modernization would ultimately produce homogeneity. Secondly, if ethnicity is rising, this is basically due to inadequate modernization. That means modernization is not taking place in the correct way. This is the falsity in the process of modernization itself. That means there are limitations of the process of modernization itself. Finally, they say it is distorted modernization. You are not modernizing correctly, you are distorting it you are rather mixing with tradition, that is why you are giving rise to that kind of identity. Now obviously there are limitations of this approach too. First of all, it fails to explain the rise and proliferation of ethnicity in the West. Now if we take it for granted that the Western countries are modern, obviously one would fail to explain why such modern countries, so-called modern countries, are giving rise to ethnic antagonisms. Then one may argue that the dehumanizing phase of modernity itself may create ethnicity. Here, Rajani Kothari was arguing about the homogenizing and majoritarianism. Homogenization and majoritarianism. Homogenization means you are homogenizing everybody, making everyone to wear the same dress, eat the same kind of food, talk in the same language. Whenever you do it, which modernity probably proposes, there will be repulsion, there will be contradiction and protest. Secondly, majority people would try to impose their culture in any kind of democratic setup. So there a kind of homogenization argument is taking place. In India, for instance, often it is argued that in order to live in India you have to become a Hindu. So that kind of argument also gives rise to sort of ethnic revival and ethnic sentiment that no, I should not go by what the majority is saying, I have my own identity. So the expressions of, say, tribalism or Islamizations are in fact reactions against majoritarian homogenization. It could also be the result of deprivation which has resulted because of the process of modernity itself. It is clear that modernization, industrialization, capitalism has produced so much of repulsions and so much of vulnerabilities. So people who are vulnerable, they are reacting to it, they are protesting against lack of development. So obviously modernization theory has failed to explain the way ethnicity is constructed. The last major approach, which is mostly accepted in social science discourses, is the social constructionist approach. They argue that ethnicity is basically a construction, a social construction. It is flexible, it is contextual, and therefore in modern world, as our identities are becoming fractured, becoming local, so we are giving rise to segmented identities at different locations. Now Max Weber and Hughes were the first to argue about the rise of that kind of interactions in the process of interaction. It is true that in the global world the kind of interaction has changed. They are not permanent, they are contextual, they are temporary. So that kind of temporariness probably have given rise to that kind of situation. Now Cassels, interestingly, and Touraine, these are the two important theoreticians on social movement, they have contributed significantly for the development of this approach. Touraine argued that knowledge is used in the construction of identity. So this is something important. You are knowledgeable, you have certain knowledge, you are using that knowledge in order to construct an identity, and in fact many of the post-globalization movement which are taking place, they are using knowledge base in order to construct a particular identity. Cassel did argue that in the network society, personal identity becomes a much more open matter. My identity is known to everybody in the Facebook. So opening up of identities is actually a reality in the contemporary world. The social constructionist approach tries to distinguish between two types of situation. The one is called group identification, the other is called social categorization. The first occurs inside the ethnic boundary and the second outside and across it. Now Jenkins has identified 4 basic elements of this model. Now this model says ethnic identity occurs due to cultural differences. Secondly, obviously ethnicity is cultural. Third, it is variable and manipulable. That means you can manipulate identity in a particular context. That means at one point I may be a Bengali, at other point I may be a Marxist, at the other point I may be from Bardhaman, not a Bengali of West Bengal variety, a particular Bengali. So you can manipulate your identity in certain context, and often you may say that you are not at all a Bengali, you are a Hindu. So these categories, different types of categories one may use in a particular context. And finally, they are also collective and individual at the same time. I have my own personal identity, at the same time I have my collective identity. So obviously I use both these identities in different contexts as it is suitable to me. Often I speak that I am Professor Bishwajit Ghosh, but at the other time I might say I am an exploited so and so. So these are both internalized and externalized. The internal identity and the external presentation, they might differ. On the whole, it is argued that cultural traditions as boundary markers are therefore invented. We invent our identities in a particular context. So the cultural markers are invented, these are achieved, not ascribed. I might have been born with certain qualities, certain given identities, but I have the capacity to reorient myself as a sort of thing. For instance, I am a Basti person living in a Basti, and I feel as a Basti person I am exploited. On the other hand, a middle class person might feel that he is living in a middle class locality, so he is being exploited. Both of them are feeling exploited but giving different reasons of that exploitation. So this is construction in a particular context. Interestingly, the social constructionist view comes closer to the postmodernist view of ethnicity, which argues that identities are relatively flexible. Flexible, they are free floating, that means they are detached from the social structure. Now, Stuart Hall was basically talking about discourses, role of discourses in the creation of identities, and he gave the notion of new ethnicity. New ethnicity means there are internal differentiation even within an ethnic group. Now, often we might take that Gorkhas of Darjeeling are united, but taking Hall's argument, one might argue that there are differences even within the Gorkhas, and these differences may proliferate at some other point of time. And in fact, there is reality in this sense, because when Subhash Gishing was mobilizing that movement and when Bimal Gurung took up the leadership, there is a change in argument. So now there is a tension going on in the Gorkha movement, and obviously there are rise of new identities. So there is, one could see rise of new identities even within a given identity. In short, the postmodernist argument of ethnicity stresses on certain features. What are these? Stress on difference and diversity. We are different, we are diverse, yet we are using identity. Secondly, they attack essentialism. One cannot say that a Bengali would always fight for Bengali. A Bengali might join some other group to fight for something else. I might join a gender group or an environmental group to fight for something else. I might sympathize the tribals fighting, fighting against, for instance, a particular industry in Odisha. Secondly, the stress on role of discourses. In certain contexts, discourse become important. The way the discourse come in and play the role, these are important. And finally, they stress on fractured identities. That means my identity is not unique, it is fractured. Unique, it could be unique in the sense that it is fractured. Fractured in the sense that I pick up different identities at different contexts, so it is liquid. Let us now evaluate the four kinds of major theories that I have talked about. Now, it appears that the way ethnicity rises, the process is very complex and often contradictory, and all these theories could be explained could be used to explain a particular moment. At certain phase, one might say that this theory is more prominent. The other phase, one might say that theory is more important. That gives the impression that ethnicity is not only complex, it is the character of ethnicity itself is such that it is liable to explain, you can explain ethnicity from different theoretical standpoint. Yet, there have been efforts to combine different approaches, and with the argument that the approaches varies from high to low. Despite such effort, it is better for us to say that we cannot just categorize a particular ethnic movement from a particular theoretical point of view. We often need to take recourse to different approaches to argue about different contours of ethnic movement. Let me now come back to the ethnic movement in India, factors affecting ethnic movement in India, to explain the factors, theoretical factors which we have already discussed. Now, taking into the whole sets of ethnic movements that have happened during the last 4 or 5 decades, I have classified the factors that are important into two categories. One I call necessary condition, the other I call sufficient conditions. Now, if you look into the northeastern movements, ethnic movements proliferating in Northeast India, you would see that many of the necessary conditions are important. What are those conditions? Economic conditions, for instance, the deprivation of a particular group, which Marxists would vehemently suggest. Then there is poverty, rise of poverty, inequality, land alienation, eviction from land, which has happened in Singur. Then domination of a majority, which Rajani Kothari was arguing. The exploitation, displacement taking place in Odisha, underdevelopment of the tribals, unemployment in Telangana, right? Influx of migrants. If you look into the northeastern states, which I will be explaining later on, the influx of migrants and refugees is a major issue. So these are the first set of conditions, necessary conditions. The second set of conditions is I call sufficient conditions, because unless and until the sufficient conditions are there, you cannot have a very strong ethnic movement. What are these? People have to feel that they were exploited. That kind of mental, psychic development, consciousness development in the level of consciousness should take place. And how does it take place? Through elite competition, through the rise of certain standard of living. In fact, all tribal movements have come to a reality after a particular phase of development. So development contributes to the development of ethnicity. That means socio-economic development contributes positively for development of ethnic identity. Now, the issue of sons of the soil, which is very prominent in the necessary condition which I was arguing about, seen in the case of Northeast India, seen in the case of Mumbai, Maharashtra. Shiv Sena was arguing for sons of the soil. So among the necessary condition, let me explain it in certain detail. Underdevelopment is the major issue in northeast India, whole of Northeast India. It was there in Punjab too. Punjabis were initially arguing for development issues, 4 issues that they raised: land, water, Chandigarh, and so on and so forth, waiving of loan. These are all socio-political issues, nothing to do with the cultural issues that became prominent later on. In Mumbai, in Maharashtra, in Telangana, underdevelopment was the issue. So whenever development is retarded, some groups may rise and demand certain things. Secondly, demographic compulsion is an issue in Northeast India. When an outsider come, they join the main folk and then become a majority. The insider versus the outsider debate become very prominent. So even in Mumbai, they were arguing the South Indians first, and then Bengalis, and then Biharis to go out of Mumbai. In US, this logic has become very prominent now, that all non-Americans should go out. This is because of the constraints that develop in a particular situation. So this is called necessary condition. Secondly, the sufficient conditions include a state of thing where elites use it for developmental, for competition purpose, apart from the process of development. Obviously, there might be some discrimination in the process of development, but it is the elite, and manipulation of the elite through a political process of competition. In the whole of Northeast India, Kashmir, everywhere, the political parties started demanding votes in the name of ethnic identity. So obviously, this has something to do with ethnic identity movement. One important factor which we must take note of is the role of the state in sufficient condition. Now it is seen that state could minimize a movement if it rationally takes up a stand and initially acts against the justified demand of a particular community. But normally, professors like TQMN studying social movement have said that state delays the movement till it develops sufficient clamor. That means till it becomes a very powerful enough, state does not look into the issues of movement. So it allows ethnic movement to grow, and only after it grows, it acknowledges it. So state has a major role in ethnicizing the issues, and Dipankar Gupta has beautifully showed it in his study of Punjab agitation, the way the state of India and the political party, ruling party at Delhi has ethnicized the Punjab issue. The other issue is the role of outside agents, foreign agents who come from outside. They have a vested interest, so they manipulate it. Let me now come back to the conclusion. We have gone through the theoretical debates, the conceptual issues, and the Indian issues. The way ethnicity rises, the factors that promote ethnicity. It has become almost clear that ethnicity is not a natural sort of thing. It is not a trans-historical phenomenon or an essential entity that only the Indians, only the Bengalis, only the Telanganites would or the Gorkhas would ask for ethnicity. Anybody can demand it, anyone can demand it in a particular context. So they are recreated and created and recreated at each and every moment of time. Whenever state punishes something, whenever there is questions of poverty and inequality, wherever there is questions of marginalization, people would protest, and ethnicity is a means here, so far as instrumentalist perspective is concerned, to give a shape to it. Because if you form unity on the basis of ethnic identity, you become a much larger strength as compared to the simple argument of economic exploitation being done to you, right? So on the basis of this, on the basis of such theoretical foundation, we may argue that ethnicity is going to proliferate in modern India. It is nothing to do with, it is not non-modern. It is very much modern in the sense that more you become modern, more you learn about your sources of exploitation or deprivation, more you learn about others being given a facility which you are not, you develop an ethnic sentiment. Not that always you become ethnic, not that you sustain your ethnic always, but you may take recourse to ethnic movement as and when it becomes necessary to you. So that means it is neither modern nor it is anti-state. Often the ethnic movement compromises with the state, and obviously one should not think too much about ethnic movement as anti-Indian or sort of it would destroy India's unity. Not at all. They are very much modern. They are a part and parcel of the social life. Rather, ethnic movements would give rise to issues of deprivation, of the rise of sufficient conditions, elite competition, awareness, which I have already talked about. So therefore, we might conclude that there is nothing inevitable about ethnic movement, and one should not be too much concerned about the rise of ethnicity in the modern world. This is rather a natural process that has happened in the contemporary world. Thank you very much.